Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our presentation in response to Piketty and Nievas' paper. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation to start us off. My name is Peter Martin.
Mennatallah. And I'm Thuy.
All right, so let's get started. So just a quick overview of what we're going to do today, a quick article summary, followed by our critiques of the paper and further expansion of the discussion, and then going all over the place. Go back. And then also just talking about questions and then open discussion. So, getting to the article, we're going to go through this quickly because Mr. Nievas went quite thoroughly into the paper. But overall, the key work of this paper is by constructing a novel historical database of trade balances and balance of payments over the period of 1800 to 2025. There are several distinctions and disaggregations between primary commodities, manufactured goods, services, foreign income, and foreign transfers. It has global coverage with with disaggregation into 48 main countries, and the rest of the regions being into 9 residual regions. And then they also provide counterfactual simulations to further bolster their claims, which we will get to. The findings are 2 distinct peaks in foreign wealth accumulation, this 1800 to 1914 period of European imperialism that is characterized by colonial transfers and low commodity prices enabling massive accumulations of foreign wealth. And then a second period from 1970 to the present day, which is more characterized by this foreign wealth accumulation in a smaller magnitude, but it's still driven by trade surpluses, primarily among Middle East oil countries, China and Japan, and then that can lead us into the key findings of this paper. Despite the differentiations that we see in these kind of periods of wealth accumulation, the authors find that throughout this time there is a distinct significance in unequal exchange and power relations in resulting in these kind of imbalances and differential development patterns. The simulations that they run for these sort of counterfactuals further kind of cement their argument that different power relations, institutions, and trade rules can have major impacts on comparative development. And then finally, they conclude the paper by suggesting that major institutional changes in international trade and monetary systems are required to introduce kind of more self-regulating, self-correcting mechanisms into global economic relations. And these kind of introduction of changes can maybe gradualist or can happen more abruptly, perhaps. And so this brings us now to our critique, where we are going to ask the question whether this kind of phenomena of unequal exchange is a flaw or a feature of the system we're looking at. And so from how we interpret kind of the work by the authors, we see that they treat unequal exchange and these imbalances that persist through time to be more so kind of the impacts of these massive period of colonial drain, but also institutional flaws and a lack of kind of collective mechanisms that can rebalance or redistribute the global economy in a more equitable way and a more balanced way. And we feel that this kind of analysis that they do is somewhat disjuncted from the historical and academic kind of literature of unequal exchange. And because of that, we're going to look into that a bit more. So when we think about, unequal exchange, especially in terms like of the power relations that are described in this, or maybe less examined in this paper, there isn't necessarily a really systemic view of what are these exact power relations that are persisting over time, that are seeing these imbalances that we see in the data. In addition, when we're talking about the financial flows of wealth, there's no discussion about necessarily theories of production or value or labor that are involved in these kind of wealth transfers that we are seeing. And additionally, there's not discussion on things like the constraints that prevent certain countries, especially in like the second period that they describe from the 1970s to 2025, why some countries are inhibited from having certain patterns of development versus others. And then so kind of the baseline of these critiques is kind of the underlying logics that perpetuate these persistent structural imbalances that we see. So moving on, when we talk about unequal exchange, it's also very important to talk about its kind of roots in dependency theory. And so I don't know if many of you have heard of Latin American structuralists or anything. But it comes from this, and one nice quote I found to describe dependency theory in a nutshell is kind of the situation in which the economy of certain countries is conditioned by the development and expansion of another. And in this, there's an implicit definition or like distinction between core and periphery states, where there is an overall flow of resources on net from the periphery into the core. And this happens internationally, which is kind of the main focus of dependency theory, but even more recent work on it has also looked at it on a domestic level. But in this, we're looking at it more internationally. And so we have works from like Prebisch and Singer in 1950 that look at these transfers in the value of goods between core and periphery states, and they say that over time in the periphery, the terms of trade are declining. And so they have different theories on the reasonings behind of this. So some of them include like income inelasticities between high and low value added goods, or difference in the markets of these economies that allow for greater surplus value extraction. And then when we get more so into thinkers like Amin and Emmanuel in the 1970s, this is where unequal exchange theory starts to appear, with thinkers like Amin doing a more empirical look at real wage differences between the core and periphery. Move on. And when we look at dependency theory and its related unequal exchange overall, I found this very nice paper by Kvangraven in 2021 that kind of creates this overall arching framework of what dependency theory and its related hypotheses entail, essentially. And so looking at it, it makes the core hypothesis that global capitalism tends to be polarizing. So, the unequal exchange we see is more so a feature instead of a flaw. And so some, but not all of other auxiliary hypotheses that go into this kind of framework include the idea that monopoly capitalism leads to unequal exchange, that peripheral economies experience falling terms of trade, and that financial constraints can lead to this kind of these imbalances in development that we see particularly in the periphery. And so methodologically, it takes a very much strong approach on a global historical approach, which is what the paper presented today also does. But what we find what sorts of lacks is kind of this focus here on structures of production and constraints faced by peripheral economies. So these structures of production can include labor markets, social relations of productions, the kinds of goods that are consumed and produced in these economies, and then also the constraints can be technological, monetary, and financial and geopolitical, but that's not all of them, but just some examples. And so we're going to dive a bit more into these sorts of constraints and other factors with Menna here.
So as Peter mentioned, we noticed that the paper primarily focuses on trade flows, and we wanted to delve into some of the other mechanisms of north-south subordination, starting with labor appropriation. So at the core of the global economic order lies the systematic appropriation of labor from the global south. And as Samir Amir argued, capitalism is then dominated by generalist monopolies that extract imperialist rent through global labor arbitrage. And this locks southern economies into dependent, low-wage, low-value-added production. And he calls this super exploitation. And it's because of this super exploitation that we have global north appropriation of 826 billion hours of labor from the south. And this is also enabled by a wage gap of 87 to 95%. Less for the same or equivalent output. This extraction is also then entrenched by the global financial system, which is shaped by creditor power. So as we all know, financial liberalization causes financial subordination of the global south countries, as they are integrated into the global financial system without having the tools to manage volatility, leaving them exposed to commodity shocks, foreign currency debt, and of course IMF conditionalities, as we can see in Argentina, Brazil, Egypt, Ukraine, Egypt. So to add to this, the US dollar's reserve currency, as was also mentioned, serves as an exorbitant privilege, while southern currencies are treated as risky, and this also enables, of course, financial arbitrage, where high interest rates, where like it forces southern countries to have higher interest rates. And here is where it gets interesting. Yes, okay. So we draw here on this part from a book by École. It's called The Divide. It's a really cool book published in 2017. And he connects this dynamic more broadly to global inequality. He states that the debt system functions as a mechanism of control, as debts that have already been repaid multiple times by the global south continue to be used to extract concessions from the global south. And this results in actually net outflows from the global south to the global north. So here it's kind of reversed actually, and it says that for every $1 received in aid, the south loses $24 through debt service, profit repatriation, and illicit financial flows. We put a graph of Africa here because it's the biggest loser of all in this system. And you can see actually this does not account for service misinvoicing. This can only account for trade misinvoicing, which means that the numbers are actually much higher. And basically Africa is also like a net creditor to the whole world, basically. So the largest share of extraction is illicit outflows, with over $1 trillion annually lost through hot money and trade misinvoicing. And how is this possible? It's possible by tax havens rooted in the UK and the US, as well as, of course, biased World Trade Organization rules, which brings us to our next point of global governance. So, for instance, in the past, custom officials were actually able to stop this in developing countries because they were allowed to check whether invoices, prices matched the real market prices, and they could actually even block this. However, since the mid-1990s, the WTO rules have required custom officials to accept invoice prices at face values, which of course made it so much easier for companies to misprice trade and steal capital legally, which is why mispricing has grown so fast. Also, while WTO does grant each member one vote, the decision making is still based on market power and exclusive green room meetings. And also, of course, the enforcement mechanisms are very asymmetrical. So in general, all in all, modern trade agreements now serve less as tools of market liberalization than as political and legal tools that entrench investor power. Because trade deals now not only focus on tariffs, they extend beyond that to regulate labor standards, environmental protections, etc. And this limits the policy space of sovereign states. And in the center of this would be the investor-state dispute settlement, which allows corporations to sue governments for regulations that threaten expected profits. And École calls this the virtual Senate because it's a global unelected body of investors and corporations that basically disciplines governments through, for example, capital flight, currency attacks, and credit downgrades. And Katie is going to talk more on how this concentrates wealth in multinational corporations.
Thank you. So now if you look at another point of view, which is from multinational corporation and FDI, so our argument here is that they are the main driver of the unequal exchange. So let's begin with a little bit of theory. So according to neoclassical economic approach, they believe that multiple multinational corporation and FDI actually work to drive a sustainable development based on three arguments. The first one is that diffusion of sustainable technology and management practice can bring in to reduce environmental impacts. But as we can tell, we don't talk about disruption of landscape, health, and communities' life. And the second argument is that multinational corporations rely on impact quantification, of which CO2 marketization and offset markets is the dominance. But basically, we burn first and we offset later. And the last one is that they rely on voluntary reporting to contribute to sustainable development. But what is about the practical impact? So this kind of approach is strongly criticized under ecological economics and post-development principles, as we all know. So now I want to introduce to you, maybe some of you know, the two hypotheses. The first one is pollution haven hypothesis, saying that due to weak environmental regulations of developing countries, some industries with high contamination and consumption will be transferred from other countries to other countries through FDI and trades. Which is very much applied for Global South or lower and middle income countries. And the second one is the opposite, which is a pollution halo hypothesis, saying that FDI flows will reduce environmental damage. And there are many papers discussing like which hypothesis is applied. For example, here you can see like Denmark and UK FDI flows will increase carbon emission in BRICS country, while the opposite is true for France, Germany, and Italy. However, most of the results found on Global South countries will support pollution haven hypothesis, which is related to institutional issue. So we found a paper by this guy with a data source from its at EHESS. I think many of you know this one. So they analyzed more than 100 multinational corporations, and they found that Western and Chinese capitalism are overrepresented in conflicts linked to energy, value, and water-intensive commodities, with systematically worse social ecological impacts. So you can see how multinational corporations represent in this picture, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And what is even more interesting is that they found Chinese and Western companies avoid mutual exploitation, meaning that Western companies like cannot exploit China, and China can also exploit Western. So they all put their presence on lower and middle income country. For example, you can see how high income country like exploit middle income country and also like low income, while China only present for 8%, like exploiting middle income countries and low income countries. So that is so now the next question is how multinational corporations allocate their FDI. From international business literature, there are many coping strategies that MNC can actually apply. However, let's talk about geoeconomics just a little bit. So there is a paper by IR published last year, saying that there is a trend of like shift in FDI flows, like investing in France. We can talk about like nearshoring, friendshoring, onshoring, all of that stuff. And they basically conclude that geopolitical actually impacts a lot in how MNC allocate their FDI, especially in strategic sectors and emerging countries. And if we look at this paper, Bonnet published this year, they're saying that onshoring and reshoring in US and China trade tension in a very key sector, which is technology, low carbon technology, and transition critical mineral industries. So this is a very cool paper if you want to take a look. They talk about how US is building relationship with global north countries, but of course facing higher cost, and how China is deeply integrated in extractivism in Africa and Southeast Asia, and also how Global South, mostly South America countries, trying to maintain their political ownership, like not to be over-dependent on other countries in protecting their resources. But the paper concluded that unequal exchange will remain, like onshoring and nearshoring, yes, but only small scale. And still, unequal exchange will be there due to material and technological accumulation and growth imperative. Because at the end of the day, they care about profits. So this is a very quick one. Geoeconomics, we can also talk about strategic industry. For example, here I bring the case of semiconductor. So basically talk about labor. So division of labor now is not like vertical, like you imagine you have one corporation that have different operations everywhere in the global, and they have different division of labor in each country. But now that division of labor is separated regionally. For the case of semiconductor, as you can tell, like USA and EU is specializing in producing equipment, while Asia regionalization, including China, China a little bit, yes, China, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and more or less Vietnam and Indonesia, is now focusing on materials and products. So labor is now divided within regions. So to conclude all the part that I want to bring here, like the problem of unequal exchange is much broader and so much influenced by so many factors. So our first question here will be that what growth model can Global South or low and middle income countries pursue to engage in FDI without continuing social ecological unequal exchange? It's a very broad question, but from my point of view, I would say to invest in human development policy.
Okay, my question would be, considering your emphasis on bargaining power and terms of trade in your analysis and counterfactual simulations, what types of feasible policies could actually produce these outcomes of convergence?
And then my question is kind of addressing how you finished the paper, talking about these need for institutional changes and there being possibilities for gradualist or more abrupt change. And so for the gradual change pathway, there would require cooperation from the North to cede some of their own institutional power, which would in theory be against their own interest. And it still puts the South in somewhat of a dependent relationship on the leniency of the global North. And so do you believe that gradual institutional reform is a feasible pathway in correcting these historical inequalities of unequal exchange, or for global South autonomy, must there be more discrete breaks from the current global system? Thank you.
No, the first question with Thuy, I agree with the idea that actually the only way for sustainable development is investment in human capital and human development. Luckily, I mean, not so like, yeah, today there is kind of a comeback of industrialization in economics. So many economists, even in the mainstream, are kind of happy with industrial policies to create jobs and ensure economic growth and then development in a country, which was not the case 20, 30 years ago. Actually, the World Bank was very critical about this, and in the 1990s were quite open voice saying, okay, industrial policies don't work, don't ever do it, don't you dare, sorry. And now, given that the hegemon powers of today, US and Europe, are contested by the rise of China, they're, oh, actually industrial policy maybe is good and we should also do it. And now economists, since they follow whatever the US needs, they're, oh, actually, they're not so bad, we should study industrial policy. I think so. I think it's a mix of, maybe we can use the momentum to allow industrial policy in the developing world as well, and then use this to invest in human capital, and this is the only thing that actually will allow for sustainable progress in the future. Of course, has to be ideally investment in green industries and so on and so forth to prevent more climate change. But I agree with you, human development is key. We should focus on green industries, and we should also impose kind of a global redistributive system. So if, I'm guessing you engage, but if not, they work with also a Paris School of Economics like Gabriel Zuckman, trying to tax these multinational corporations to send the money to the global south for development policies. Actually, it's something that we should be doing already, but we are not. And I completely agree. The second question, I think the only way to achieve convergence would be kind of paying colonial reparations plus redistributing, like paying colonial reparations, pardoning debt, or paying whatever the profit that or the development that these countries, developing countries, could not do because they were too busy paying the foreign debt that kind of the imperial countries imposed on them, would be a global policy that could help to achieve convergence, that then also should be combined with the reply in this first question about really industrializing and developing the economy in a sustainable way of the developing countries. And for that, mostly investing in education and health is the only way I see this happening. And then, no, of course it has to be, so let me quickly share, which is also related to the point that Mena did about how the World Bank and IMF institutions are governed by the rich countries. I'm not going to present a whole new paper, but this is a working paper I have with Paula Druschke, which is a pre-doc at the World Inequality Lab. But basically, and soon to be out, maybe in January, but basically we study the institutional voting power of these big institutions and see what they result on. And basically, more undemocratic institutions like the World Bank, IMF, work worse in terms of the global economic outcomes than the more democratic ones like the UN. Let me skip everything very quickly. But yeah, this is, for instance, the voting power of the World Bank dividing the world in quintiles of GDP per capita, so weighted per population. So here you have the 20% of the population that lives in the richest countries, and here you have the 80% of the population. So you, in each line you have the same amount of people, so 1.8 billion more or less at the end of the period. And you see that the ones that have that live in rich countries are completely overrepresented. They have 70% of the votes of these institutions, which are the ones, as you mentioned, the ones that get benefit from it, from everything. So in the end, if they get benefit, what's their incentive to change things? None. Maybe the fact that China is rising and pushing towards this, changing this system, and if not creating their own parallel system, gives an incentive to the rich countries to actually open the game to global democracy if they don't want to be dominated by China. Basically, let me show you later. Like this is how the IMF assigns voting power, and it's basically a formula that depends on your GDP, trade openness, variability of capital flows and reserves, so which are typically things that are higher if you are richer because you have more GDP, more trade. Of course, it has completely a bit stupid, the formula. This is what results in this. If we project how the world is growing today, and we assume that the world keeps moving as it is moving today, and we apply the formula, the same formula, then China and Southeast Asian countries will kind of dominate the IMF. So our hope is that the countries that are here now, the rich countries of Europe plus the US, will kind of understand that even if they stick to their stupid formula where if you have more money, you have more votes, they will lose their power soon. And maybe this gives them an incentive to change things. But then we don't know. Yeah. Simply that China keeps rising. Yeah, GDP, trade, and so on. That I mean, if everything keeps evolving as it was evolving, so this is constructed like if everything keeps evolving as if it was evolving the past 20 or 30 years, I think. But the time the reach of GDP per capita of rich countries evolve at the same time, at the same rate as the rich countries, so they kind of converge. And you apply the IMF formula. This is what will result. Of course, rich countries are known to change formulas whenever they contest them. So actually, that's what the US did when they wanted to give Japan more power in the 80s. They released votes to Japan and then said, okay, veto power used to be 25%, will be 15 now, and we'll keep 16% of votes until 26. So yeah. So it doesn't mean that it will happen, but automatically this is what should happen if we follow the rules. So maybe this will actually give an incentive for them to change things. Yeah, I don't want to show anything else. But actually, just maybe. Then, because someone mentioned free trade agreements used as a political tool, what we find in this paper is that the funds of the World Bank used to go a lot to countries that have a defense, a military alliance with the G7 countries. Now it's so, but they go to countries that have either a defense alliance with G7 countries, a military alliance, or a free trade agreement with the G7 countries, or a free trade agreement with G7 countries. So the G7 countries are using really the World Bank institutions to send money to their friends, and this is very related to these comments. And I think this is it from these papers.
And I was wondering if you could expand a bit on that, and if, in your opinion, this would indeed bring some type of convergence. I'm very skeptical of the possibility of this system bringing convergence because of so many other aspects that my colleagues already exposed. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more on that. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Gian from Peru. Okay, first, yeah, I would like to ask. I think it's already mentioned, but why don't? First of all, it's very curious that it's not cited the penalties in the paper. But in the paper, like, but in the slides, yes. But I think it could be also included in the paper. I don't know. But the thing I would ask maybe is like this different framework when you compare maybe Piketty analysis and the dependencies theory analysis. I think there are like two policy like conclusions, and I see like why just this question, why don't merge this, kind of try to engage in a at least in a conversation between these two literature, because I would say it will be very helpful first to unite these structured, more emphasized structured productions and colonial structured productions to these prices, mechanisms, imbalances that you found with Piketty. And also I think it will be bring consequences to maybe to some historical variables that you find, because I would say financial dependency it's like plays a big role, and even with this policy that you find out that maybe just reparations, etc., it will be not solve the problem, because it's not just like trade imbalances problem, but is more about production and structure of production, and also how these relate to this dependency that is still on and is carried from colonial times. But yeah, I was like just to why not just both merge and maybe bring a more debate between these two.
Okay, third one, and then okay.
Oh, okay. Hello, I'm Ben from India. I would like to know about the database that is being created by Inequality Lab for the 1800s and the 1900s. So, for example, when I was reading the paper of Asimoglu on the causality between the rich and the poor countries, he was sort of using the mortality rate to be like a variable for considering the causality. But in the case of, when I was briefly looking into Inequality Lab, it sort of uses the estate tax records or the fiscal data to sort of find the inequality between countries during these eras when there weren't a proper database that is being created. So if you could share some insights about how this is being calculated and how it works, and why World Inequality Lab is sort of considered to be the gold standard when it comes to these sort of databases, and what is unique with the lab, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay. First round.
Top. Okay, let's start with Sofia. So basically, to be clear on the International Clearing Union, so 1943, 1944, when they see the end of the Second World near, the US and UK kind of start planning the world ahead, and John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White, who's a representative from the US, start debating, okay, what should we do? How do we ensure a kind of harmonic system? Do we go back to the gold standard or not? And they have like lots of economic discussions. And the result is basically the IMF and the World Bank, more or less how we know them today, a bit different. But Keynes was quite actually afraid of how central the US would be after this system, basically because the dollar would be the main currency. At that time, the US, unlike now, was recording lots of trade surpluses, and they were feared that if they kept recording trade surpluses, they would accumulate lots of foreign wealth to the expense of the rest of the world. So they would try to stop it, more or less. So he comes to the idea of an international clearing union issuing the global currency, the Bancor, to take the dollar out of it and to ensure that this international clearing union will maintain parity of exchange rates and coordinate them if you need to change them, plus will charge an interest rate to the debtor countries or the surpluses countries. So if you have a big debt, you will have to pay, but also if you accumulate lots of wealth like China today, you will have to pay because it means that you're somehow, even we don't know how, you're somehow benefiting from the system, and you need to compensate the rest of the world that is being worse off. And then we will need to change your exchange rate or something to make sure that in the long run we get to an equilibrium where no one has lots of deficits or surpluses. So he really was focused on, okay, let's not have these global imbalances. They don't have systemic and sustained current account surplus or deficit from certain countries. That being said, Keynes, even though he was a nice guy, he was a British economist, so he was very much trying to keep Britain in the economic discussion. So when you read his original plan for International Credit Union, several times in several articles, he states, in the case of a dispute, the US and UK will have the final vote to resolve whatever it's the matter. And basically he was, I mean, nice economic idea, he was trying the UK not to fade out from the global arena mostly. We think the economic idea points to a certain good direction. Of course, we don't want the US and UK to have veto power about anything. But we think that maybe trying a global currency I don't think will solve the solution now because the imbalances are super big now. But what I think is that starting from a point where no one has huge debt, it will more or less allow for a stable system. And if not, it provides you the instrument to actually legislate and try to see how to kind of reform or to achieve this stable system. That provided that, as we discussed before, the governance of this new international institution is democratic and it's not US majority plus Western European rule, because then as the IMF right now, what's the incentive if that's the case? So if we manage to have a really democratic institution, maybe we could prevent global imbalances in the past. Then what we do with the global imbalances of today, that's a different question. For developing countries, I would like to find a way to actually restructure their debt and so on. Yeah. Restructure is the politically correct way to say it. Then, yes, about engaging more with dependency theory. Yeah, I mean, I come from Argentina. I've studied them. I really like their work. I would to say this. We now cite them all in the or the main contributions in the paper. We did not do at the beginning, and it was completely my fault. And basically, when we work in mainstream economics, if you already cite Lenin as we do, then you are very careful of what people can read and not get crazy. But it was a mistake, and we now include all of them. The truth is that since Cardoso and Feleto until Hickel today, let me see the conclusions that we get, and we see our analysis as complementary to whatever the dependency theory discusses. I'm very happy with Manuel Cardoso Feleto. I discussed with Jason Hickel. He's great. He's always very encouraging. Of course, Previch I love, and so on. And we simply bring a different aspect that no one quantified, and we saw a gap in the literature and thought, okay, this has not been measured. It needs to be measured, and that's what we try to do. And we think what we do is complementary to what they discussed before. And then for Ben, I have no idea. No, I mean, I know more or less, but honestly, this is other people that do it at will, so I don't know the details or the nitty-gritty of what they do. I know they spend lots of time on actually getting this data well and so on. Typically, someone like Thomas, Emmanuel Saez have done it for France. Thomas Gabriel and Emmanuel have done it for the US. Facundo Alvarado did it for Argentina. Typically, I'm also Manchi, Nitin Bhutar, I think is the name. Thomas Piketty and Lucas Chancel have done it for India. There's this very nice paper from British Rush to Rush Billion or something like this, where they analyzed India and long-run inequality. I don't really know what they do with the details and how they combine this fiscal and tax data, which I know is super messy and lots of data work. But since I'm still in the wheel and I do completely different things, I never had to deal with this. But I think you can find everything what they do in either appendixes or the technical notes that they always publish. But what I understand is it's very annoying and time-consuming work what they do. But I understand your Acemoglu point because I also don't agree much with their paper.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Diego and I'm from Switzerland. I was a bit surprised by your counterfactuals, where you kind of assume, I don't know, colonialism or slavery wouldn't happen, because for me it seems kind of impossible to do this thought experiment of taking such a fundamental historical fact that influenced like the whole institutions and everything, kind of to isolate this. I don't know if you can say something to this approach.
Hello, I'm Marina from the best country on the world, Argentina. No, mentira. At the end of the presentation, you talk about that the only way of discussing about sustainable development should be the structural transformation of this world trade. And then you said to Mena that maybe the only incentive to US to change or IMF to change this way of voting democracy would be the rise of China. So it's not that dangerous in a political way to see like the only way out of like the rise of another like a big power. I mean, in all the scenarios, there's like only these big players and a lot of losers, or we can think in other type of actually make a transformation of these world institutions in a more democratic and not so concentrate powers.
Hello, I'm Florian from Germany. Thanks for the presentation. I would be interested in, since like you frame your whole paper in terms of unequal exchange and also propose the Keynes plan as a solution, I'd be interested in whether you think that your contributions and the contributions of the World Inequality Lab in general will lead to a renewed interest in heterodox literature in the mainstream. And if this would be the case, do you think that you will also actually engage in the theoretical discussions of those concepts, or do you see like your role rather in empirical research?
It's very trivial, my question, so what are you saying? Hello, my name is Sophie, I'm from Belgium. My question is a bit trivial maybe, but I was not like understanding how do you account colonial transfers and what is like the metric that you use to quantify that? Can you a bit expand on that, please? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me start with, was it Diego from Switzerland or? Okay. No, I mean, yeah, what we try to do with this exercise is simply saying if developing countries had the money that they had to spend or they were taking away from by the empires and they invested this in development policies, then we would see a better world where countries converge to a better economic situation. By any means, this means that it would have happened because history tells you that then the empire will bring the boats with the guns to your shore and then they will seize whatever they want to seize. So no, I think it's hard to imagine a world where colonialism wouldn't happen. I mean, yeah, it's hard, but it's actually not so crazy. We have that today, more or less, so it's not a complete panacea. But it would have been, I mean, the fact that taking this into taking colonial transfer from the numbers wouldn't have taken away the power relations between these countries. The only thing we're trying to the picture here is how much they really lost from colonialism, these countries. So the only way to see, or the only way we think about it's possible to see how much they really lost is where would they be today if there were no colonialism. But I mean, it wouldn't have happened, that for sure. Marina from the world champion country, So when I said that maybe the way that the US releases power, it's China. I was not saying that then the US gives room to the new hegemon China. I was saying that given the threat of China, maybe the US and Europe think, okay, it's either us or China, how we can stay more or less in the balance of power. Okay, let's open the game to the whole world. Let's bring Brazil, India, all of the developing countries. Let's build a democratic system that prevents us from being ruled by China. Well, that doesn't mean that will happen, but maybe it's the opportunity to do it, because if they don't and they keep respecting what they said they would respect in the IMF Articles of Agreement, at some point they should give room to a new hegemon. And I think no one that likes democracy wants a world with a hegemon, say the US, Europe, China, Russia, whatever. I think we all want a more democratic global governance, at least in this room, I hope. Then Florent from Germany. If this would bring a renewed interest in the heterodox literature, not from my side. I'm very happy with my interest in I really like the heterodox literature. I think my contribution is basically, because also that's my comparative advantage, try to measure many things that I think they're not measured, quantified, and try to expose them to the people that are not convinced about the things that happen in the world. So I presented this work in mainstream departments where some people have told me, okay, you shouldn't complain about colonialism because South countries were able to develop thanks to colonialism, and they got railroads and so on, and they built hospital and schools, so actually they're better off even though they stole their money. So faced that kind of reply from mainstream economists, I think what I try to do is try to face them with the facts that everyone kind of knows, but so far haven't been documented as well as to give this discussion. But yeah, hopefully more people actually engage in these topics. But then I think it's a constant fight. And then for Sophie, so colonial transfers are literally money stolen from the colonies due to coercion. So as the UK case I repeated, they simply raise taxes and either ship them to the empire back, or they use it to pay for goods produced in the countries, and then they ship the goods to the empire back. So it's a kind of a narrow, and we could be underestimating colonial transfers because there are all other things that are a result of a power relation, like public debt, or like the operation of the East India Company, that we don't classify as colonial transfers, but we classify them as capital or capital income. So, for instance, the profits of the East Indian Company for us, following accounting rules, is capital income, and one could argue that actually, and one would be right to argue that the East Indian Company was an imperial instrument. So in the end, our colonial transfers are really, really, really the most narrow definition, and it's this imposition either of this home budget, day-to-day charges, or the war tributes that the powers are imposing in China, Haiti, and these countries.
Do you think that if a new bancor was put in place, it should actually implement other dynamics that is not only like financial capital, as for example like total emissions of carbon emissions and other and other factors that influence especially like global south countries that of course still rely on extractivism and raw material exports? Yeah, thank you. And if you could like maybe try to give some insights on how like a more broad on accounting bancor could be created. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Jonas from Switzerland, and I would like to double down on your response to the question about simulations, because I'm not yet convinced by your answer, especially considering the fact that the whole 20th century was really built on this on the fact that there were colonial transfers and so on, right? I mean, like, especially First World War, and to a certain extent also Second World War, that has especially been started by countries that kind of lost out a bit in this race for colonialism. Like, I mean, where do you see the merit to especially then use this whole timeline? I see the fact of like the interest in counting how large this effect was, but I would argue like countries would have just totally developed differently, especially considering a period of more than 100 years. So yeah, maybe you can develop a bit more further on that.
I really appreciate your point of trying to essentially empirically prove dependency theory and currency hierarchies, right? At least as my viewing. My initial question was partially already responded because my initial question would be, how is the reception of your findings or of this paper amongst especially European circles, both heterodox and orthodox? But then you sort of addressed it. We also heard a little bit here. And then my second question is, do you have maybe a fear of these findings kind of falling into like a limbo between strands? Because I would say like, you probably could have a lot of criticism from mainstream theory about data manipulation, right? Especially regarding what Jonas, for example, mentioned. And for the second part is maybe like also what Ian already mentioned, maybe like following criticism from more heterodox theory regarding this like more too sterile of an analysis, right? Like not going hardcore into dependency theory. Thank you.
That's very tricky because in monetary issues, yeah, you don't know how much you want to put other policy objectives into that. So it depends on if you want the bank to really be simply a currency where countries transact with each other and then they stop relying on the US dollar, the euro, so on. So the way I see it, for instance, now with Argentina trades with Brazil, we pay in dollars, and then, for instance, Lula is always complaining about this, and he's right, why would you have to pay in dollars to a neighbor country? So Argentina and Brazil will have still the peso and the real, and then they will trade themselves with this bank that is issued by international institution, and then it kind of regulates all of this. I'm not sure, so we have the past years experience of central banks also having environmental concerns and so on. I don't know what's the result. We don't actually know much if it's so good or not to have that. I think we should have international institutions that will rule and kind of regulate all certain things of the environment, policies, and give an environmental framework that is actually imposed, which we don't have today. I don't know if mixing this with the issuing of a currency is the good thing to do, or maybe we keep the things separate, but we make sure that both work by itself. So I think maybe this is the best, but actually we don't know because we never tried as a global society, a global currency. I think as a starters, I would start with something simple, but then I think actually the developmental role of the other institutions should also be reinforced. So the World Bank should be actually doing more and better developing world. Someone should be ensuring that the rich countries do not pollute so much and they stick to the Paris Agreement as they sign, and maybe they even go even farther than that, and so on and so forth. Jonas, yes, I agree completely. Yeah, I mean, everything would have changed actually. So in any case, I mean, either you say, okay, imperial countries would have actually not allow this, and they will plunder any country that they could find, even if either that, or you say, okay, actually the global south countries would have industrialized much earlier, would have achieved economic independence very early, and they would have even outperformed the rich countries of the global north, which would then underperform them because they actually performed better through these 200 years thanks to what they stole from the rest of the world. In that case, we actually are underestimating kind of the benefits of not having had colonialism, more or less. But I mean, anything we do actually in 200 years of history, something would have changed differently. We try to do the simplest thing possible to do something and to really try to show the people that tell you, okay, colonialism wasn't so bad. And then maybe if with a simple change, it would have been much better, and then not taking into account even that actually the developing countries would have been like much better maybe if they really managed to neutralize and so on. And Luca, yeah, I live in that limbo between mainstream and heterodox economics, and it's not so easy. So we got criticism from mainstream economics, not because of the data, because we're quite clean and with the data and everything is online, and you can check how we did it. The Excel files are there, since the raw data to the final results and so on and so forth. So, and we're very transparent with what we have, what we don't have, what we assume, what we don't assume. They do copy kind of Jonas' criticism in the fact of actually, yeah, everything is very nice descriptively, but then you cannot simulate anything because things would have changed. And I think they do that mainly because they don't want to acknowledge that we could have had a different development trajectory. So they hide themselves in the idea of there is not enough, like there is not a real scientific answer to this question, than to the fact that yeah, they had behind that to simply say we don't want to see a different answer. But then actually we got many more heterodox critiques than I would have expected, much more than from the mainstream. Which is fine, I think. I mean, basically, no one really said, okay, what you're saying is wrong, or someone showed this before. Mostly they were annoyed because we didn't engage in the discussion they were having. We didn't plan to engage. We simply wanted to show the facts as they were, and we would have thought that actually that would have been helpful for them, because now they have lots of data to study what they like and want to study, and we hope that they use it. And some, I mean, I talked to some of them, and mostly they were like about the trends we show and the data we uncover. They were super happy. Then they would have liked us to engage more, as you say, with whatever they discuss. But it wasn't the objective of this paper, and for me, I think it's fine. Yeah.
In the end of the paper, talking about the possible further extensions of this kind of empirical research, you talk about like potentially extending it back to like 1500 or other dimensions of like multi-sectoral analysis or things like that. And do you think there is that kind of data out there to go that far in a robust, feasible way, or even extend into like things like ecological unequal exchange and other dimensions on that kind of scale?
Okay, so let me first start. Like, if extending back in the past would be super nice, especially we will get a better picture of what was the Spanish and the Portuguese colonies. I haven't really looked at the data thoroughly. I think in many cases there is more data than what we think about, but then you get super excited and then there is not so much data. But typically colonial or imperial archives have recorded many things that have happened. And if you really find the good archive, then if you find a good archive about Spanish colonies, you only need one. You need only the Spanish Empire, and then you kind of cover what they cover. So I think it's feasible, but I really haven't engaged. Then to the other dimensions of the, but this would be a completely different paper. This is not the scope of this paper so far, and it won't be. But I think it's in the pipeline of my research agenda, and it will happen at some point. And on other dimensions of expanding this sectoral division and so on. So some advertising. The Wheel is preparing a global justice report, which you can find online, and Global Justice Report, I think it's called, where we analyze many things historically. I mean, the team as a whole. I only work on this and another paper, but there are many papers analyzing human capital, sectoral composition, and so on. And it's going to be released, I think, in end of May. there will be a conference in Paris School of Economics. If you're in Paris, you should go and attend and see the presentations. And there, each team is dealing with a different aspect: environment, sectoral division, human capital. I don't remember what else, but you should really check it out. And each of them is dealing with the best data they have and trying to be very transparent on what they do. And yeah, I mean, sometimes for some data you can go until 1800, for some other data you can only go until 1950, for 1910. So I think in the end it really depends case specific. And in the report, each chapter is like a different paper. There's one about gender also, where they have very good data for the past 50, 60 years and more or less good data for the past century and less good data for before. But you can see, and I think it's quite cool if you could check it out. And that's how we're trying to expand the reach.